The radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody, welcome to Yaron Brook Show on this Saturday evening. I hope everybody's doing well and having a great weekend. I'm excited. We've got Amesh back with us today. He's been with us since really, I don't know if this is fourth, fifth, sixth show since February of last year. He's my go-to guy when it comes to issues related to COVID. He's been a lot of help, both personally and just on how to think about this, but also personally in terms of just medical advice for people that I care a lot about, and that's all been spot on. And he's been right from the beginning. That's the other amazing thing. So some of the numbers you projected in February, some of the sad numbers you projected in February have actually turned out to be all true. All right, we're going to get to Amesh in a minute. Just quickly remind everybody, just a few things. Tomorrow, we will have a show at 1 p.m. East Coast time. 1 p.m. East Coast time will be tomorrow. We are going to, I've got a small session with, whoever signs up. It'll be, I think, 14 people, something like that, on socialism, and that'll be on December 18th. You can get information about that on the website if you want to sign up for that. And it should be a lot of fun. The last one we did on capitalism was a lot of fun. You can use the super chat today to ask questions of Amesh. We're going to stick to the topic, at least for the first hour while he's here with us. Let's just make sure that the questions are all related to COVID, policy around COVID, new variant, things going on in the world related to COVID, but let's stick to that, or to infectious diseases more broadly. So the things that Amesh is expert on. And then we'll see, I might stay on after Amesh has to run, and then you can ask general questions about anything. We'll see how the show goes. So first, Amesh, thanks for coming on. I'm not going to go through your whole bio. You've been here enough that I think everybody knows who you are. So thanks for being on.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Sure. So almost 2 years in. Really 2 years in since the first cases in Wuhan. We now know probably a little bit more than 2 years, starting sometime in November, or certainly in December, they were reporting first 2 cases. Any kind of, it's a big question, but kind of assessment of where we are. You said it last time you were on the show, you said it was going to be endemic. Is that still your sense? And how does that play out? How do you think that plays out from here?
I've always thought that this is going to be an endemic virus because it's not something that can be eliminated. It's not something that can be eradicated because it has an animal host. It transmits efficiently through the respiratory route. It's not something that even meets the criteria. So what we know is that this will eventually become something that we deal with every year. This is not going to be, there's always going to be some time when there's always going to be a baseline number of COVID cases, hospitalizations, and even deaths. It's going to be one of our seasonal respiratory viruses. And the goal was to remove its ability to kill, remove its ability to crush hospitals by immunity in the population, primarily through vaccination, getting tools like antivirals, rapid tests, all of that to kind of defang it and make it much more manageable. And we're getting there, but it's very variable depending upon where you live. So certain parts of the United States, they probably have reached that because they've got such high levels of vaccination. But other parts, for example, West Virginia, 41% of the population is fully vaccinated. They're not near that level yet. And the same is true around the world. So many European countries have very high vaccination rates. Canada certainly does as well. But there are other parts of Asia, Africa, where it's very, very low. So they're going to continue to have issues with COVID until they get that immunity level higher. But that's the trajectory. It's just not something that happens all of a sudden. It's gradual. And it also has to do with how people think about it, their ability to risk calculate and understand that there is no zero COVID, that everything is going to have some level of COVID risk, but you've learned a lot about it. You've got vaccinations, you've got antivirals. So this is a manageable risk. That's sort of how something goes from the pandemic phase to an endemic phase. And it's going to be, rocky for people to get used to that because they haven't had to risk calculate, because the way the government set this up was a false alternative. Either you want no COVID risk is acceptable, or COVID doesn't exist. And the truth is actually in the middle. And I think that's what's happened.
And when we say it's going to be endemic and it's going to be with us forever, does the science suggest that it gets weaker? I mean, does it put aside our immunity, but does it start getting weaker? Does it become a common cold? Because we know that some coronaviruses, I guess 4 common colds are coronaviruses. Is that the long-term trajectory of a virus like this, to get weaker over time?
It's sort of the general principle in virology that you often see respiratory viruses that spread efficiently start to mutate or start to be selected by evolution to become more efficient at transmitting and not causing as severe disease. Because if you're a virus, you want to infect more people if it actually has one. So that's basically what's happening. So if you're making people really sick and they're not able to go out, they're stuck at home in their bed, or they're in a hospital, that's not very good from the virus's perspective, because they're not going to be able to infect people at the hospital who are taking care of them with masks and gowns and gloves. The virus needs people to be out there going to the grocery store or going to school or going to work. So the milder it gets, the easier it is for it to transmit. And that's what many of our respiratory viruses do. So that's the hypothesis, that this will eventually happen. And we think maybe one of those 4 common cold-causing coronaviruses was responsible for a pandemic in the late 19th century, in the late 1800s. And now we deal with it all the time. But it just takes some time for that to happen. And clearly, it's not at that phase if it's still killing 1,000 people a day in the United States. And there are hospitals like the one I worked at just now, where 30% of the population in the hospital are COVID patients, all unvaccinated. But that's not, so we're not quite there yet, but that's probably where this is going. And we could talk about Omicron and maybe the hypotheses about it being one of the first signs of that.
Yep. So let's, before we get to Omicron, let's talk about the issues around vaccines. So there's a lot of stories out there about vaccines because people are confused, right? So on the one hand, you've got countries like Israel where you had very high vaccination rates, very early vaccination rates, and then you saw this massive spike in cases. I was in Israel when that happened. They immediately went to boosters. They were the first country, I think, that went to boosters and boosted everybody. But then now we're seeing massive spikes in Germany, which is not as well vaccinated as Israel, but still it's in the 60%, 70%, maybe what people talked about way back as the range for natural immunity. And of course, UK, we saw the same thing in the UK. So I think people are confused about this because they thought that once 60, 70% of the population was vaccinated, this would go away. And then the other aspect of that is that a lot of the people, and maybe you can clarify how many, because it is confusing, a lot of the people who are getting COVID are vaccinated. That is, there seem to be at least, I don't know, superficially, there seem to be more people with breakout cases than one would have expected based on the kind of Pfizer and Moderna numbers initially. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's just kind of the impression. I think it's part of why people, I think, are confused about the vaccinations. So can you clarify kind of all of that?
Okay, so there's a whole bunch of points to try to explain. So first of all, let's think about, so we saw these Moderna, Pfizer, J&J had these high efficacy numbers from the clinical trials. It's important to remember that when those clinical trials were done, especially Moderna and Pfizer, many parts of the world were under lockdown. There was little chance to get exposed. People were all wearing masks. So that's going to bias your result in favor of the vaccine. Because so before we
go on, so tell us how these tests are actually done. So they take a population of people and they let them live their lives and half get and half not, and some will get the, so it really does depend on the conditions under when the test is done.
Exactly, because at the time, if your daily life is nothing is open, you can't go do anything, you're obviously going to have less exposure to COVID than if you do a trial right now. So first of all, there's that level, there's that issue, is that those efficacies in the trials were not real world conditions, and because the real world changed.
Yeah.
Number one is that at the time of Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, we were dealing with the ancestral strain, the Wuhan strain of the virus. Soon after that, the Alpha strain emerged, then the Delta strain. those Alpha and Delta, even though the vaccines did a really good job, there was a decrease in the amount of protection. And at the same time, people were getting pandemic fatigue, saying, I'm sick of this. Many of the mask mandates went away. Things started opening back up. People started to learn to risk calculate. So their activities also gave them a higher chance of coming into contact with COVID-19. And when they got in contact with it, they weren't getting contacted by the ancestral strain that the vaccines were designed against, but the Alpha and the Delta and Beta and Gamma as well. So there's going to be a diminution as well because it's not quite as matched. And then the other point is, yes, there is some waning, but these first generation vaccines, their primary goal wasn't to block every infection. They're not force fields. They're not bug zappers. They're meant to make any breakthrough infection mild. That's what their goal is. So the fact is, yes, breakthrough infections are happening, but the fact that they're mild and most people don't have to call their doctor when they get them is a sign not of the vaccine failing or not working as well as it once did, but it's actually a success. There may be second generation vaccines that are better and maybe more like the measles vaccine. Maybe there'll be nasal spray vaccines because these vaccines don't give you a lot of antibodies in a special type of antibody that gets produced in your nose, which is how you get infected. These ones are not the best at doing that. So that's the issue. So breakthrough infections were always expected. I think people just misunderstood what a vaccine was doing. And I think they got spoiled by seeing those numbers from the clinical trials. Yeah. But yes, breakthrough infections occur. And I think the other point is that they're not severe. That's something that we have to kind of cheer about, but that's being used against the vaccines. And those breakthrough infections are less contagious than someone who doesn't have a vaccine because you're contagious for a shorter period of time when you get a breakthrough. So I have no problem with the vaccines. I think they're the solution to COVID and Omicron. I don't think that there's any issue that we can actually blame on the vaccines. I think it's very, very almost unjust to the vaccines. I think it comes from a misunderstanding and the anti-vaccine movement kind of taking data and presenting it in a certain way to confuse people who don't really have all the expertise or the knowledge of what this vaccine was meant to do or how those clinical trials are going on or the context of different variants and people's activities having an impact.
So there was a story out there that for a while that the first shot of the vaccine hurt your immunity somehow, and you were more susceptible to COVID after the first shot. And it until you got the second shot and 2 weeks after, there was increased susceptibility to COVID. Is there anything to that? Have you seen anything in the numbers suggesting any of that?
No, I've seen actually the opposite. About a week after your first dose, you started to see cases drop. So if you look at the original Pfizer and Moderna trials, after their first dose, a week later, cases, that's where there's lots of separation between the placebo and the vaccine group. So that's the exact opposite. One dose is definitely better than 0 doses. Good.
And then you mentioned that so the breakthrough cases are milder. Is there now solid? I mean, are the numbers solid in terms of the number of breakthrough cases that go to hospital, the number of breakthrough cases that ultimately die? Some people are going to hospital still, and some people are dying. But are the numbers significantly lower than unvaccinated?
Yes, it's like around 14 times less likely to die if you're vaccinated, 11 times less likely to be hospitalized if you're fully vaccinated. And I think when you look at breakthrough infections that are severe, that's where there actually is a role for boosters in people who are above the age of 65, people who have high risk conditions, people who may have gotten the J&J because it seems to top off that immunity. That's where boosters make sense. And that's why they were authorized initially for those groups, because that's where we saw erosion of protection against severe disease, which is what the vaccines were meant to do.
So you would suggest boosters for people with either over a certain age or people with pre-existing conditions or comorbidities?
Yeah, I do. I think so. Where it comes down to for me is above the age of 65, any medical condition that puts you at higher risk, including being overweight or obese. And then also people who got the J&J vaccine, because that probably should be a 2-dose vaccine. The J&J vaccine didn't actually drop. It just stays around that 70% efficacy. And if you get an mRNA boost, it goes up higher. So I think those people can benefit from that.
Let me see. So we've got a bunch of questions already. Let me pull out at least the ones about vaccines. So Brian asks, there's some personal advice here. So Brian asks, it looks like the risk from COVID for someone like me under 30 and healthy is very low. I understand that the vaccines lower that risk even further, But at what point is the risk so small that it's not worth lowering?
Well, it depends on what you mean by risk. I mean, yes, you're at very low risk for being hospitalized, but if you get infected, you could go infect somebody else. That's something that, why would you want to be in that situation if you can prevent it with the vaccine? And you're going to have to take 10 days off from work. You're going to have to tell your contacts that you were in, that you're positive, and they need to then they need to quarantine and get tested. Why disrupt everything when you can take a safe and effective vaccine and minimize that whole disruption that COVID-19 poses to you? It's not just about severe disease. It's about why have that illness when you can prevent it. And we take vaccines for lots of things that are even almost like nuisances to many people. You know, they give children vaccines for chickenpox, which was a nuisance disease. So I think I still think that those are valuable, even if you're not at high risk. But particularly, it's important about transmission. I think that's the most important thing. Why put yourself in a situation where you could accidentally infect somebody? And it doesn't take it down to zero, but it lowers it significantly.
So do we have a number on how much, if I'm vaccinated in a particular situation or not vaccinated in a particular situation, how less likely is it for me to get the virus if I'm vaccinated? Do we have any kind of numbers?
So that number has changed over time, but
Yep.
in the immediate months after getting a vaccine, it's probably 60-70% at least with the Delta variant out there right now, and then it will drop off. But if you're investigating an outbreak, you're not going to be looking at the vaccinated people first as the spreader. It's likely to be an unvaccinated person.
Even though, because people take anecdotal stories and that's what, they blow them out of proportion. And that's, people can't think statistically and probabilistically, so they look at anecdotes. So even though you might find they might be a vaccinated super spreader, it's super unusual and super rare.
Yes, it is. And there were some evidence. There was this thing that happened in Provincetown in Rhode Island where there was this huge festival and people got infected there. But that wasn't normal behavior of vaccinated people. It was Bear Week there. It was a big party, lots of alcohol. It was bad weather. Everybody was indoors and lots of singing and yelling. That's not normal. And they did have cases there, but all those cases were mild. But in the average life of a vaccinated person, yes, you might have some risk of transmitting to somebody else, especially if you're symptomatic. That's why if you get sick even if you're fully vaccinated, you should get tested and know and make sure you don't expose anybody. But you're contagious for a shorter period of time, and it's not likely that you're going to be the one that spreads it. It's hard to figure out the magnitude because it all depends on activities and what you're doing and what the situation is. But in general, it's not vaccinated people driving transmission. Yes, they can get infected. Yes, they're increasingly more breakthroughs, and there's going to be more breakthroughs with Omicron, but they're not the issue in terms of the overall spread. The proportion is much smaller than the unvaccinated groups.
So John asks, Amesh, would you recommend a healthy pregnant woman get a booster dose if they're already fully vaccinated?
Yes, I would. I think pregnant women are at high risk for severe disease. I consider that a high risk condition. Pregnant women are more likely to be hospitalized, more likely to get in the ICU, more likely to get a C-section, preterm labor, stillbirth, all of that. So pregnant women should be boosted.
And what's what is the research looking at the effect of the vaccines on the fetuses?
It's good, actually, because the placenta, you get transplacental transmission of the antibody, so you can protect your newborn by getting vaccinated when you're pregnant. There is no untoward effects to the fetus, no higher rates of miscarriages. It's actually good for the fetus if its mother gets vaccinated.
And what are the latest numbers on this, what was it, the heart inflammation? And there was something in the American Heart Association yesterday, I think. It turned out there was an abstract that said that there was an increase to heart disease for 5 years after, that they are now questioning that there's I was just reading it today, there's a whole thing at the American Heart Association about this. But in terms of the heart inflammation for young people taking the vaccine, so put it this way, are there downsides to the vaccines? Is there any risk analysis to taking a vaccine in terms of downsides to taking them?
Every medicine you take has a risk-benefit ratio. Nothing is 100% safe, not Tylenol, not ibuprofen, and not any vaccine. Mm-hmm. So when you look at the risk of myocarditis, I think it's important to remember a few things. Number one, myocarditis is more common with COVID-19 than it is with the vaccines. Today I rounded at the hospital. I have an 18-year-old kid not vaccinated, myocarditis from COVID, which is an interesting thing to see. But he's not vaccinated. It's more common in that situation. The risk for myocarditis is not in everyone. The risk is very limited into certain populations. So it's late teens to like 20s males, because it might be testosterone driven. And that's where it occurs. The myocarditis that occurs is very different than other myocarditis. It's transient, it's mild, no one dies from it. They obviously get hospitalized because people get scared when their hearts are inflamed, but it's very manageable. It doesn't occur with all the vaccines. It seems to be more common with the mRNAs, specifically Moderna. Moderna is a higher dose vaccine. And it's not after the first dose, it tends to be more after the second dose. And there's evidence that if you space those doses more than 3 to 4 weeks, if you space them 8 to 12 weeks, they'll actually work better and you mitigate that myocarditis risk. So I think this is something very manageable. And I tell people, if you're really worried about it and you're above 18, you can get the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and not worry about it. But if you're a small child, if you're worrying about your child and they're not a teenager, they're maybe less than pre-pubertal, I don't think there's a major risk there. And if you're really worried, just space the vaccines 8 to 12 weeks of the mRNAs, which are available for children. So I don't think that this is as big of a deal as possible, as people have made it out to be. But yes, there is a myocarditis risk there, but I think it's something that can be managed and it's mitigatable. And I think it's still outweighed by the benefit of the vaccine, not because this child is going to get severe disease, but because it's disruptive. They have to go home from school. All of this kind of cascading impact. So I think this is something that is definitely not as big a deal as some people have made it out to be, but it is something that's real. You have to counsel patients about it. And I think it's important for if parents have questions about it to ask those questions. And I think if you've got somebody that's knowledgeable, there's ways to work through this so that you can make an informed decision about the vaccine.
So again, kind of anecdotes, people are posting all over the place, anecdotes of people they know who got vaccinated and then died. What does the research show about these cases? I mean, how many of them have shown causal links, or are there any scientific studies looking at deaths caused by the vaccines?
It's very, very, very rare. There's just, I think, almost a handful related to the Johnson & Johnson blood clotting issue, the AstraZeneca blood clotting issue that we saw, and a few rare immune side effects that have occurred. So it's not that big. And I think it's because people misinterpret the vaccine adverse events reporting system that the CDC has set up. They misinterpret it because, it's something that's meant to be a catch-all where anybody can put something in. You could put something in, I could put something in, and it's meant to just be this big data repository where trained scientists look through that and sift through it and say, do I see a signal? Is there a signal here? Is this something we need to investigate? So, but people are looking at that raw data without any training and then reporting from it. And I think that's how this idea that there's deaths or all of this stuff gets, and I get asked this question a lot, that all of these deaths and all these horrible things are in there, but anybody can report everything. And just because something happens after a vaccination doesn't mean it was caused by the vaccine.
Yep.
If you're vaccinating a bunch of nursing home patients, some of them are going to die the next day. So that's not because of the vaccine. There's lightning strikes in there. If you read in the VAERS database, they'll say someone got the vaccine and got struck by lightning. There's some people who say that magnets now stick to them. That's in the VAERS database. There's a lot of things in there and you have to interpret it very, very carefully. It's not meant to be.
It's that chip from metal that Bill Gates is injecting into all of us through the vaccines. So Ryan asks, what is the risk of a vaccinated individual getting a severe case of long COVID? Some of the outcomes you hear about are long-term and life-altering, such as chronic fatigue.
So this is still an open question. It's definitely much less if you are fully vaccinated. And the problem is that we don't have good definitions of long COVID. We don't quite know what it is. And I think we have to get a lot better at defining it, because lots of things get put into long COVID. So someone could have a chronic cough like 6 weeks later, and that gets called long COVID, but most viruses will give you a chronic, so there's a certain percentage of people with any viral infection that have a chronic cough. So we've got to separate what's actually disabling or interferes with your activities of daily living versus what's a nuisance type of thing. So some people's taste and smell may be a little bit off for a while. I don't consider that long COVID unless maybe you're a chef or you work in a perfume factory or something like that. It's not the same type of thing, but there are people that have difficulties concentrating. There's like accountants that can't add anymore. Those are real issues. And I don't know I think the percentage is going to be much smaller when you actually drill into what actually disables someone. But it seems to be much less with people that are fully vaccinated. We don't know. Like I said, it's a little bit of a mystery. It seems to be more common in women, more common in older people, and more common with people with other medical problems. but it's still, we're only on the infancy, basically in the infancy of understanding what this is or how it occurs. And it may be something that happens with lots of infectious diseases. There's just a lot of attention to it right now because there's a lot of people that got sick. So I would say that the best way to prevent yourself from getting long COVID is to be vaccinated. The chance you get it is lower. There's some people will say 50% lower. I think it's probably lower than that, but the data is around 50, at least from some of the studies, is around 50%. But again, those are poor definitions of what long COVID actually is.
Do we know that long COVID is real versus, kind of a psychosomatic kind of thing?
I do think it's real. I think that
Okay.
but I think the percentage that you're seeing, so you might see a paper where they'll say 30%. I think that's much too high. It's probably less than 5%. I have one patient that I've been dealing with that clearly has had a major functional decline. And some of it can be exacerbated by the fact that you get COVID and you can't do it. There's lockdown. All of these issues probably play a role and they all coincide. There may be higher levels of psychiatric illness in those people, meaning that they had pre-existing depression. They may have had pre-existing anxiety disorder. And it might be that there is, I think with many illnesses, there is some psychosomatic component to it. But I think that still makes it's still real because the patient's still not able to get back to their baseline and they're still looking for help. And I think we'll get to the bottom of this eventually. Lots of big centers are setting up long haul COVID clinics to try and understand what's going on here, but it's going to take some time, and it's frustrating for the patients and it's frustrating for the doctors because everything comes back normal except for their function.
So we've got a lot of questions, a lot of good questions. So this is good, but I'm trying to clear all the vaccine questions all at once, and then we'll get to some of your other questions. So thank you guys. Some of you are putting a lot of dollars on these questions, and that's great. Quint asks, do you recommend vaccination in 5 to 11-year-olds?
In general, I do recommend it because I think it's a safe and effective vaccine. Why get the illness if you can avoid it? I don't think it's absolutely mandatory, but I think it's something that avoids your child getting something that's disruptive. It keeps them in school because right now the threshold to send a kid to shut a school down or go to virtual is still very low. So I think that if this wasn't a safe and effective vaccine, there's a different calculation. But I'm very confident in the data in children, so I do recommend that parents get their children vaccinated. I don't think that it's not the most important vaccine in a child. I think I would rather have them all get flu vaccines. But I think this is an easy vaccine for them to get, and there's not a major. I think it's like me recommending everybody get an iPhone. I think everybody should have an iPhone. Why not have an iPhone? That's what I think of the vaccines. I think of them as iPhones. I want the newest one as soon as it's out that day.
So what do you think of schools that are still I know universities where they're acquiring vaccines and then they all sit in class with masks on?
There has to be off ramps. If you have a fully vaccinated student body, like Yale had a fully vaccinated student body, it makes no sense to continue this to act as if those people are not vaccinated, because we're always going to have some COVID risk. There's always going to be cases. But if you've had a fully vaccinated student body, the worst that's going to happen is you get some cases. It's much easier to handle. I understand in the pre-vaccine era that they were very worried about outbreaks and disruption. But now, what's the point of getting vaccinated if nothing changes? Yep. So I think that they should have off ramps. I wrote a piece in the New York Daily News a couple of weeks ago, an op-ed about this that people can look up, where I talked about off ramps. And I think that we have to start moving towards off ramps in organizations like universities and as a country, as a state, as a city, as a county. All of that has to be in the discussion as we move toward this endemic phase, that we've got to get people to learn to risk calculate and get this idea that the post-pandemic world is going to be 2019. It's not. The post-pandemic world is a world with COVID.
And you were never supportive of schools closing for the whole school year in 2020 and 2021.
I think this could have been managed very easy. Maybe you might have needed it for a minute just to figure out what's going on, but it needed to come back right away. And it's interesting because in Europe, schools were the last thing to close and the first thing to open. But here it was the exact opposite. So I didn't think schools should have closed to begin with. And then what was going on was really a travesty, damaging children really badly because this at-home learning was not working. And I think there was a lot of politics that played a role here because the teachers' unions got involved and it became very, very politicized in a way that made it impossible to open the schools because they have such a political force. And in the end, it became, this is an area where, for example, President Biden campaigned on this, getting schools open, and most of them are open now. He's sort of delivered on that, but early on, and it was taking some time for them to get open. And the CDC director was saying, we don't have to vaccinate children or vaccinate teachers. We know how to do this. We've seen this work. And then the President Biden's his press secretary said, oh, she was just speaking on her personal behalf, not on the Biden administration behalf, because the teachers unions were so involved in this. So I think, yes, this was one of the hugest mistakes with the pandemic, was the school closures.
Daniel asks, any risk from taking the vaccine for nursing mothers?
No, it's good to take it for nursing mothers, because then the antibodies get passed to the newborn through breast milk. So those are people that absolutely should be getting vaccinated to protect the newborn.
Adam is asking, he's 75. He's on I guess a trial for prostate cancer. He's had 3 Moderna shots. He's asking how long before he should get a 4th.
I think we don't really know that answer yet. Probably at least 6 months. There may be, since I'm assuming because you've got prostate cancer, you're going to be getting immunosuppressants. There may be better solutions for immunocompromised people. We may give them long-acting monoclonal antibodies. AstraZeneca has a long-acting monoclonal antibody that's about to get an emergency use authorization. That will probably be used in immunosuppressed populations and maybe give them extra immunity for a year on top of the vaccine. That's likely what will happen in your case.
Okay, let me see. All right, let's talk about Omicron, the new variant. I'm always bad at names. Yeah. What's your estimate? I know there's still limited data coming out, but what's your estimate from what we've heard out of South Africa and what scientists around the world are figuring out about this? So
there's a couple of things. First of all, so the Omicron variant was something that got discovered in South Africa around early November, and it got people's attention because it has a lot of mutations in the spike protein, and the spike protein is what the virus uses to attach to cells. It's what our antibodies attack. So people were really worried about it because some of the mutations they saw were seen in other variants, like the beta and gamma variant, which you don't hear that much about, but would have the ability to get around immunity. And it also had certain mutations that made it likely to be able to transmit more rapidly. And then they saw this uptick in cases in South Africa. They were having a lull, and then cases started going up in that one province, which I probably can't pronounce, Gauteng. It went up in that province. So they're worrying this is all happening at the same time, and they're worried about a more dangerous variant. Right now, I think there's still a lot more questions that need to be answered, but a couple of points. So this is something that didn't descend from Delta. It's a new whole branch of the virus family tree. It's something that probably descends from a virus that hadn't been seen since mid-2020. It might have evolved in an immunocompromised host and just developed all these mutations. Some people hypothesize that it might have jumped into an animal and then came back into humans, because we are seeing deer and mink and all kinds of cats and dogs get infected. We don't know that yet. But what's also important is the fact that it occurred in South Africa, likely in the Southern African countries, makes sense because that's a low vaccination area. 25% of the population is fully vaccinated in South Africa, and that is the most vaccinated African country. So what we know so far is that we're seeing cases there. The anecdotal reports in some of the early case series seem to be that this is mild, that it's not something that is really sickening people to the point that we're seeing hospitals worried. There was I just tweeted a bunch of things from South Africa saying that many of the people that are getting picked up are incidental hospital screenings. This is all good news.
Good.
It seems that the vaccines, even if this variant can get around some of the immunity that vaccines provide, the vaccines are still doing what they're meant to do, prevent serious illness, hospitalization, and death, that the hospitalized people tend to be unvaccinated. And the cases that we've seen all around the world, which is not surprising, these were already spreading in the Netherlands before South Africa even discovered them. No one has died. I think in the United States, only one person went to an ER. That's all really good. There is a hypothesis that this might be something that is evolving towards what a common cold causing COVID would be like, that it's able to get around immunity just like other coronaviruses can, but it's losing its ability to cause severe disease. That would be something we would all take. It would be great. But obviously there's a lot of panic that's occurred because that's just what politicians and political people do. Even though all of us, everyone in my field was saying no travel bans, we were unanimous, but it still happened. And it happened for countries that didn't, and only picked 8 countries for the US. some of which, and there were countries that had community spread like the Netherlands, which were not included. And just a lot of badness that happened in South Africa. We want all these answers about this variant in South Africa, saying we can't get reagents to do these experiments because you've travel banned us. So how are we going to do these experiments? And they get and if you want people to be transparent and talk about the variants, talk about what they've discovered, you can't punish them like this. It's really backwards. And now we've got community spread in New York and all kinds of places all around the world, but the travel bans are still in place. It really makes no sense. And President Biden said he feels bad, but that's not enough. I mean, he campaigned on the fact that he wouldn't do this. He rightly criticized the Trump administration for doing this. But now when he's in power, he did the exact same thing, which to me is disappointing. But I guess that's what happens when you deal with politicians.
And it's not just travel bans. I mean, all these countries are increasing. I mean, Israel shut down completely. A lot of these countries are increasing testing. They're increasing requirements. They're increasing isolation when you land there. So UK was easy to go into, and now it's become almost impossible. And of course I mean, you'd think they'd learn, but they seem to panic anew every single time.
Yeah, it's as if the last 2 years didn't happen. It's not like we're January of 2020. We know so much about this virus. We've got tests. We've got vaccines that are protecting against serious illness. We've got monoclonal antibodies, at least one of which is going to work against this. We have antivirals like remdesivir. In the UK, the Merck antiviral is actually approved. So this is baffling to me that they basically turned the clock all the way back and went back into panic mode, and then panicked the entire world because of the way they acted. So it's just very frustrating to see these mistakes keep getting made over and over again.
Yeah, I mean, I'm constantly shocked by how aggressive Israel is in just shutting everything down. They're also really good at rolling out vaccines, but on everything else, they've been terrible. Including.
I think this comes back to not understanding the goals. Some people continue to chase cases. We're always going to have a baseline number of cases. You have to think about severe disease. That's our goal. So cases are going to come and go. You can't make actions. You can't make your public health actions based on cases, especially in the post-vaccine era. And I think these politicians continue to get very nervous about cases. And yes, cases are disruptive, but they're not of the same caliber as they were 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm. So you told me, talk about politicians. You told me you had a run-in with the Prime Minister of New Zealand.
And so this is a funny story, and the New Zealand people will continue to attack me after this, but I had to do their morning show, their version of Good Morning America. And if you remember, New Zealand was the zero COVID policy. They've been shut down, very aggressive. They at that time had just shut down Auckland for one case. And I said, this is a non-sustainable approach. You're not teaching your population how to risk calculate. This is not going to work. This is the wrong approach. And I basically said something like that on their Good Morning America. And then I just started getting a lot of attacks on Twitter, on everywhere. And then the next day, the Prime Minister went on that same show and rebutted me. But then she also had her people call my employer and chew them out for this, and then continue to have an onslaught of people just spamming all of my social media.
Wow.
Not just Twitter, but LinkedIn and everything. Then they asked me to do a debate with their chief epidemiologist on their version of NPR, which I did. And I would not back down. I said, I continue to, he says, will you admit that we did the right thing? I said, no, I will not admit, because I disagree with that policy. You can't tell people you can't treat indoor activities the same as outdoor activities. You can't do all of this. And it just became a major divisive thing where I actually had to tell the FBI that I was getting death threats and the threats from New Zealand that I didn't, because I had opposed their lockdown policy. So those people who think that I'm in favor of lockdown, that is the furthest thing from it. And
sure.
eventually, just a couple of maybe about 2 months ago, she basically said, yes, this was the wrong policy. That we need to move on. We're not in the same situation. But it's just interesting how much, how that COVID zero, how people want to stick to it. And they had, New Zealand did have a very low number of deaths, but at what cost? They had less COVID deaths than they actually had flu. So I said, what are you going to do? What have you taught? What's going to happen now? Because you had more flu deaths than you had COVID deaths. How are you going to have a sustainable approach if this is your approach to any infectious disease? It was just a crazy episode.
And it looks like maybe New Zealand has changed its approach, but things in Australia are nuts. I mean, they're still putting people, dragging people out of their homes, putting them into isolation, and everybody's vast parts of Australia still locked down.
Yeah, I have no understanding of where this is coming from. And it's mind-boggling to me. And the kind of surveillance state tactics they're using, just calling your phone and telling you to turn your camera on, using drones, all of that doesn't really bode well for what the level of freedom in Australia. This is, one of the worst approaches, probably, on the way of, like in Wuhan, they were nailing people in their houses. This is very similar to that.
So let's move to therapeutics, and then we'll go to some of these questions. So let's start with the kind of the existing drugs that people have been trying and playing around with. Ivermectin is an example. There's been talk over the last year of doing a big study in ivermectin. There was Oxford was going to do something, and then there were other places, I think in the US. Whatever happened with those trials? Because all you get are these second, third, fourth rate studies that come out. It came out primarily out of the third world that have very, some of them are really dubious and some of them are just so. But where's the state of the art kind of study to show us one way or the other?
So there is a trial, I think it's called the Principal trial that Oxford is doing. I think that's still ongoing. I haven't seen any interim results. That's the one that everybody's waiting for to be able to kind of stop these trials and say we have enough information. All of trials, as you said, are very mixed. Many of them had fraud. People had to withdraw them. Some of them had made up things inside them, which is very strange. And there was one negative trial that showed there wasn't a benefit that was published in JAMA, which is one of our premier medical journals. So very few of these get published in high-level journals. I think in my mind, ivermectin, there's no evidence that it's going to work. It may work to treat worm infections, but we've always said that if you immunosuppress someone, and that's what steroids are, dexamethasone is an immunosuppressant, that if you have untreated infection with certain worms, that can come out and it can be disastrous. So that may be, that's an interesting variable that may play a role in why you might have seen some benefit, but not probably for COVID, but for actually treating an undiagnosed worm infection. But I think this is another issue that I think is completely gotten politicized, where I get the most threats of anything when I talk about ivermectin, more so than even hydroxychloroquine, which is strange to me. And it's interesting, the ivermectin people haven't gone on to fluvoxamine, where there actually is some good data that was published in two major journals, JAMA and the Lancet. They haven't glommed onto that, which I just don't. So I think this is very puzzling to me, people's attachment to ivermectin. It would be awesome if it worked. None of us didn't want it to work, but it doesn't. And we've got better things out there. And the thing is, it's not, we have doctors that will not just prescribe ivermectin, but they'll say, don't take the vaccine. You've got ivermectin in your medicine closet. That's dangerous to do, to substitute the vaccine for ivermectin, or don't get a monoclonal antibody because I'm just going to give you this ivermectin. And then taking the veterinary horse paste, that to me is mind boggling. And the fact that now veterinarians are worrying that they're running out of ivermectin because so many people are buying veterinary ivermectin. But there's people drinking hydrogen peroxide. I just read something about people eating dirt now because they think that will help them with COVID. So there's a lot of things. I think it's the voice of the dark ages again, and it's scary.
And you mentioned the one drug that seems to have positive response. It's an antidepressant, I think. Mm-hmm. It's a mild antidepressant. Are doctors prescribing that? Is that something that's being used out there?
Not that much, but I think that there's interest in it. I think that we've got two good trials. The trials show some decreased ER visits. They're not hard endpoints. We like to see decreased mortality. That's what we're looking for, or decreased ICU use. So people are wanting a bigger trial just to be able to say this for sure, but there clearly is a signal there. And I wouldn't fault any doctor that prescribed fluvoxamine in a responsible manner, not as a substitute for the vaccine, not as a substitute for monoclonal antibodies, but something that's a relatively safe drug. Half the population is on an SSRI anyway. This is another SSRI. But it's an interesting thing. I want to see a little bit more data, but I'm not negative on it at all.
So Gail is asking, is there science to show the nasal spray alkalol could be preventive as an extra measure?
Nasal spray, what's the word? Can you spell it?
Alkalol, ALKALOL. ALKALOL.
I don't know any evidence of that. I think they're nasal spray vaccines that are in trials. I haven't seen anything specific on that, but I may not be, I may not, that's not nothing I'm aware of.
Okay. And what is going on with the other vaccines that we talked about? There were a number of other companies working in vaccines. Are they still?
Yeah, they're percolating.
Something we're anticipating?
Yeah, so Novavax will likely have a successful candidate. Novavax has filed for approval in Canada, and I believe Australia, maybe Indonesia as well. This is another innovative vaccine. It uses recombinant technology. It uses insect cells to produce the spike protein. This is one that was part of Operation Warp Speed. I suspect it will be around. I hope it actually gets approved in the US, because some people who don't want to use Moderna, J&J, and Pfizer, maybe they'll get this one, because we still have about 60 million Americans that are eligible to be vaccinated that are not. So this will likely happen. There are other second generation vaccines, nasal spray vaccines, like we talked about earlier, maybe universal coronavirus vaccines that will take out those other 4 coronaviruses that cause the common cold. That would be awesome too. So I think there'll be a lot of innovation with coronavirus vaccines. We're just at the dawn with these first generation vaccines.
That's cool. So the FDA, I guess the panel, I don't know if the FDA has actually given emergency authorization, just approved the Merck drug. Pfizer, I think, is up next, and it looks pretty favorable to Pfizer. The Merck studies look fairly mixed. What do you think of that? And then what's your assessment of the Pfizer drug?
So the Merck drug, it's a little bit of a disappointment that it only prevents hospitalization by 30%, and the absolute risk is not very big. Between people who got this and didn't get it, about 3 percentage points. So that's why if you look at the FDA advisory committee vote, it was mixed, because some people said, is this really worth it? Especially because we have monoclonal antibodies, and especially because Pfizer has a drug in the wings. So I think this has a role. It's not going to be a knockout punch, but I think it's a good sign that we're getting oral antivirals, because that's part of the taming of this virus, making it much more manageable. There may be some issues, and there's going to be issues with pregnant women, because this is the way this antiviral works, is it makes the virus mutate a lot. So people are worried that it may make other things mutate. So it's not going to be approved for pregnant women. It's probably going to be something that has a limited role. I probably would favor the monoclonal antibodies over it based on the data. And I think the Pfizer drug looks like it's got much higher efficacy. It uses a different type of mechanism. And the Merck drug was sort of repurposed. They were using it for respiratory viruses. The Pfizer drug is specifically designed for SARS-CoV-2. So it's not surprising that it has very high efficacy. And for those people who think that my 100 shares of Merck bias me, I'm telling you, this is not a knockout drug. And the 100 shares don't make that much of a difference to me to say that I'm somehow owned by Merck. That's a strange thing. I have done work on gram-negative with that bacteria from Merck, but I don't have any horse in this race when it comes to the antivirals, and I'm probably predisposed towards the Pfizer drug and the monoclonal antibodies being superior to Merck. But I think it will have a role, and I think it will be good to have just another tool in the toolkit. And it's already approved in the UK, so I think this will come in the US pretty soon. And
do you think the Pfizer drug is a knockout punch?
If the data hold 90% protection against hospitalization and death with an oral drug, you have a 5-day window to get it. I think that would be really a major blow to the virus and its ability to crush hospitals if you can get people oral drugs, because monoclonal antibodies, they work, but they need to be infused or injected. There's a lot of paperwork I had to fill out so many times. It's such bureaucracy at the hospitals to fill this out that it's not easy to do. And then you've got to get an appointment, and because it's injected or infused, you've got to make sure they have room to do it there. I know we talked about a patient that needed this earlier on, how difficult it can be to do that, and that's made them very hard to use, and they were underutilized. So if you could just call someone and they tell you you're positive, you send them a prescription, it shows up at their door, that's a much better a prospect. The thing that we have to make sure, though, is that people can be tested. We need to be testing a lot more for these drugs to be used optimally, both Merck and the Pfizer drug, because you get the sniffles, you should get tested and then get the drug quickly, because you've got this window of opportunity for it to work. But these are the Pfizer drug is very exciting. I think the Merck drug has a role, but a little bit of a smaller role than what people hope for.
And any sense when the Pfizer drug is approved? I know the CEO of Pfizer has been complaining about holdups at the FDA.
I think sometime in December, they're going to have an advisory committee meeting and all of that stuff. There is just a lot of bureaucracy and steps. And what's happening in this pandemic is every step is going very deliberate, because there's so many people saying this is being rushed and they're not going to take it, or they don't like it. So everything is very transparent and slow for the most part. So I think probably for the Pfizer drug, I suspect maybe by the new year, in the best case scenario, the Merck drug probably in the next couple of weeks. It's imminent. The FDA acting director is probably going to issue an approval any day now.
All right, we've got, let's go through some of these questions, the kind of bigger questions. Amish, being an authority in the field, in your field of expertise, what are your thoughts about how your scientific assessment should be considered in relation to other sciences such as economics? I guess I don't understand the question. I don't know if you do.
No, I know. I'm a doctor that specializes in this. That's been working on this since I was a medical student, and I think you should judge for what I say. If it's actually true, if it holds up, if it integrates with everything else you say, everything else I say, or everything that you know about, just judge me like you would judge anybody else giving you expert advice. I think it's not. I don't claim to be omniscient. I don't claim to not make mistakes. I try my best to analyze it and give you my analysis of it, and hopefully that's correct and it holds up. But I don't think I'm a sage or anything like this on this or claim to be.
Maybe he's asking, is your field, do you sense, more accurate in terms of the science and economics is, right? Than something like economics, which does a pretty bleak history of predicting anything.
I think modeling is different because most of our infectious disease modeling work comes from economics, that they've actually borrowed it. But when it comes to the science and facts of this is what's happening, COVID attaches to the SARS-CoV-2 virus attaches to this receptor. This is how this drug works. That's very accurate. The harder sciences, or the more you're closer to the life sciences, I think the more accurate you are. I think actually Ayn Rand had a quote about biology not being as corruptible. But so in that sense, yes. But I think when we get to the modeling, that's always going to have a lot of uncertainty because there is assumptions built into that, and those assumptions might not necessarily be true, and people's behavior changes. You make an epidemic curve that's based on people acting the same way, but then people's behavior changes because now they get scared or they don't get scared. That's why we sometimes use what are called agent-based models to stimulate what people do. But yes, those models are not always going to be accurate. They have to be interpreted with a context, and sometimes policymakers look at a model and then make a decision without actually understanding that there's certain assumptions in those. I think that's probably what happened in economics, that whole perfect competition model got taken out of context. That happens a lot in infectious disease because a policymaker sees this graph, they see their whole country turning red, and then they freak out, not knowing that there's all these assumptions built in. So I've always, you have to look at models with a critical eye and try to figure out what the assumptions are. There were models of Ebola causing 4 million deaths during 2014. I remember. And I used to say that's completely crazy. That's just not going to happen. That's just a thought experiment. And you have to look at that. You have to look at the models that way. They can help you. They're decision-making tools, but they're not reality. They're an attempt to model reality, and they can be wrong if you don't get it all right.
Shazbad asks, what role do you think the internet plays in our response to COVID? Would our first response to influenza, I guess in 1918, have been similar if we had internet back then?
It's interesting. So I think the internet is a force for good and for bad because we learned so much about this virus. People remember that first heroic doctor, that ophthalmologist in China who ended up dying. He put it on a little bulletin board that this is what's going on. So the internet does get lots of information out. That's how scientists communicate. That's how I do Zoom calls with people. I gave lectures in Wuhan during that and get information. So the internet is a really great tool for spreading information quickly in a way that we couldn't do before, waiting for a journal article to get published and getting it in the mail. That's not going to be good when you're responding to a pandemic. But then I think there's, the voices of the dark ages, again, can use the tools of the 21st century to spread their misinformation. So I think that's been a really hard thing to deal with because there is a lot of misinformation out there and it spreads very quickly and people can look things up without, a lot of guidance and they may believe something that's not true. So there is pluses and minuses. On the whole, though, I think the internet has made it much, much better in terms of response because we learn about things much, much faster. In 1918, it was interesting because you talk about information. There was actually censorship in almost every country because of World War I, including in the US. And that's how poor Spain got blamed for this whole thing because they were neutral in World War I. So their press was free, whereas you couldn't write anything in the United States that would undermine the war effort. During the Wilson administration, he put this law in effect that you couldn't write, that talking about 1918 flu, which likely probably started in the United States in Kansas, that you couldn't actually write about it because it would undermine the war effort. So it was illegal to talk about it. So there was information problems there were information problems the other way in 1918.
So Michael asks, Amesh, you said during your talk at OCON, there is a high likelihood of a real pandemic with a 60% mortality rate. Could you elaborate on why you think that and what would that look like? Would lockdowns be justified in that lifeboat scenario?
So I talked about the fact that COVID-19 is something with a mortality rate of 0.5, 0.6, something that's not a severe pandemic on that scale. 1918 is probably 1 to 2% mortality rate. So this is not a severe pandemic in the sense of it's intrinsic. What made it so bad was policymakers, their human factors. But I do worry about certain bird flu viruses that have 60%, 30%, 40% mortality rates. They may get lower if they adapt to humans just based on that hypothesis about how things evolve. But I think it would be, if we handle it any way that we handled COVID-19, it would be disastrous. I couldn't even predict what politicians would do if something like that happened. I think it would be apocalyptic and cataclysmic. I think the only thing that we could do is hope that, because so many people know the importance of pandemic preparedness and thinking about this now after their lives got destroyed by COVID-19, either how many deaths occurred, plus all the disruption to the world, that they're actually trying to get this right. With flu, we do a lot more preparation. We do a lot more surveillance and understanding of those viruses so that we're likely to have a vaccine quicker. We've got antivirals, we've got some tools. But I think if there was something like that spreading, it would be, I don't know. I just imagine it would be almost like the Black Death in terms of how people would respond based on what they're doing now with Omicron or what they did with the beginning of COVID-19. So it's unfathomable to me, but I think what we would have to do, and that's sort of what you're working for now, is to try to fortify ourselves so that doesn't happen when one of those viruses inevitably jumps into humans, that we don't get this response. But I just have no confidence in the political, our policymakers to be able to act rationally in the face of something like that.
And in terms of your profession, are you seeing people as worried as you are, and as motivated to try to get, once COVID, let's say, subsides, to try to get better policy in place?
We're all doing that right now. I'm scheduled to testify in front of Congress next week. So this is all happening, that they're listening finally, because they now think this will keep them in office probably. But yes, I think everybody knows that there's a window of opportunity to fix some of this. The public health community and the infectious disease community is a little bit split. Some people, where the whole pandemic split all of us, just the way it split the country. Mm-hmm. But so that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. But all of us recognize that there's major improvements that could happen in terms of policy, in terms of public health laws, to get it all on a better footing. Hopefully that happens. There's a lot of talk in Congress. We'll see what actually happens in the end. But at least they're interested and they're listening in a way that they haven't for a long, long time.
Well, you said that going into COVID, there was a plan much better than what was actually done. It was just never executed. Right.
We had the CDC had done all kinds of plans on how to do all of this. And when they talk about lockdowns and school closures, it was all voluntary stuff. It was never forced, but that basically went out the window immediately. Yes, I think it's not as if this was something that came out of nowhere. We had been worrying about coronaviruses for some time. I actually wrote a whole report on characteristics of pandemic pathogens in 2016, if you want to Google that, where I talk about coronaviruses as a high consequence type of thing to happen and what it will look like. But many of our recommendations never actually got put into place. What happens is Congress has a very short attention span. It's boom and bust, panic and neglect. So after the anthrax attack, yes, there was a lot of interest in getting all of this stuff fixed, but then nothing else happened for a little bit. And then the same thing happened with the bird flu scare. And then the same thing with Zika and Ebola and H1N1. It just goes up and down, up and down. If it's out of the headlines, the politicians stop caring about it. And then nothing ever happens. That's why after H1N1, they didn't replete the N95s in the Strategic National Stockpile, even though we were telling them for year after year, you have to do this. It's like a simple thing. Just put them in there. It's just buy some more and put them there. And they just didn't do it. It's just inexcusable. And again, it's the nature of dealing with politicians, that they're very short ranged. And if it's not in the headlines, they don't think of it as a priority.
Yeah. Let's see. Michael asks, if you've got some more time, there are a few more questions here.
Yeah.
Amesh, do you think social justice and affirmative action policies have diminished the quality of doctors and medical staff over the decades? Should people be worried about getting surgeries because their doctors might be social justice appointees?
No, I don't. I wouldn't worry about that. I still think it's a rigorous training program, and we don't have. If you can get through residency training, board certification, that's still pretty objective. And I think, if you're looking, Yaron, you just did a big show on the AMA, I think the whole field is very into that. So it's not even the most competent doctors, most of them are in that camp. So no, I wouldn't worry about it. I think It's not as, I think medicine has a self-correcting mechanism pretty quickly, and the malpractice lawyers are part of that self-correcting mechanism. So I don't think it's anything I would worry about at this point. I don't think it's devolved to that stage yet.
Is your sense of medical schools that they're keeping up the high standards, or is there some erosion going on? And maybe we shouldn't be worried today, but we should be worried in 20 years.
Well, they have moved away from being heavily reliant on the MCAT, which is the entrance examination. Mm-hmm. They've moved a lot of classes to pass fail instead of giving people a grade. That's, I think, something that's difficult that could eventually have some issue overall. But the subject matter hasn't changed. It doesn't get easier. You still have to memorize all of that stuff, and you still have to understand, and you still have to take care of patients, and that's staring you right in the face if you either get that right or you don't get that right. So I think it's a little bit harder for that to erode completely. Maybe someday it will, but I think there's a lot of forces that kind of push objectivity in medicine that are kind of almost inherent in it.
Yeah, because it's a life or death kind of a profession. Okay, Bogdan asks, so politicians are overreacting or in panic mode because of Omicron, but why are scientists worried about it, since besides being more contagious, not much is known about it?
Well, scientists are worried about it because it has a whole bunch of mutations that give our vaccines problems, that give our monoclonal antibodies problems, that give quote unquote natural immunity problems, and it seems to be more transmissible. And you have a world that is mostly not vaccinated. So anything that allows this virus to spread more rapidly is going to be a problem. Maybe not in a country where we have a lot of people vaccinated, but most of the world is not vaccinated. So yes, this could be disastrous for many places if it's going to displace Delta and transmit more efficiently than Delta and get around pre-existing immunity the way it's doing in South Africa. It's clearly infecting people that had been infected with the Delta variant or the Beta variant before. So that's why people are worried about it. And it increased. It wasn't just an oddity that they found. They found at the same time, cases were going up, percent positivity was going up on their tests. So that's why they were worried about it. But I think scientists, when they express uncertainty or interest in something like this, it gets interpreted as panic. And I don't think the scientists are panicked about it. They say, we've got questions to answer, and this is a small problem right now. Delta is still killing everybody all around the world. Delta is a bigger problem than Omicron is, but we have to track this down and run it down. But then the politicians took that and turned it into, let's stop travel, let's do this, let's do that, which is a totally different approach. And I have a piece in The Hill about that. I wrote an op-ed I wrote about how we didn't know enough to actually panic, but that's what policymakers do.
Yep. Jeff asks, offenders hesitating vaccination over a component in the vaccines that can cross the blood-brain barrier and cause strokes, or is found in stroke patients. Any truth to this?
None that I have seen, no. And I would want to know exactly where they read that, because there's so much misinformation out there. I've not seen any evidence of that with any of the vaccines. There's just so much out there that's not true.
So Ian writes, after 9/11, we got the TSA, Patriot Act, etc. After COVID, it doesn't seem like there's even a political push to reform the FDA, CDC. Do you think there's any chance of real reform happening at that level?
It's going to be difficult. I think that people have been, I think that the FDA has worked at the best that it can in its constraints in terms of emergency use authorizations, being pretty forthcoming with them. I think there is an effort to just kind of overhaul the CDC and make it much more independent. At least lots of us are advocating for that, but it's very hard to do, because even in the Biden administration, we all feel that the CDC director is being sidelined again. And I think it's very hard because of the way these organizations, I think the CDC should be more, if it's going to exist, it should be more like the Fed, where there's a little bit of independence, because right now, you're at the behest of the Secretary of HHS or the president, if you're the CDC director, and they control who you talk to in a way that probably the Fed chief doesn't have to get his comments approved by the White House. I think that's something I would really advocate, is just make it like the Fed, get it down to its core function of communicable disease, and I think we'd be in a lot better shape.
Yep. Somebody's asking if the debate with New Zealand is available online anyway.
They didn't release the audio. They released a transcript of it.
Okay. So what do people search? Just your name, New Zealand, something like that?
Then you'll probably read all kinds of nasty stuff about me from the New Zealanders. But yes, his name, I've forgotten his name. But yes, if you write radio debate COVID New Zealand, my name, you should be able to find it.
Okay. So Stephen asks, Is Dr. Adalja familiar with Dr. Peter McCullough? I think I'm pronouncing that right, in Dallas, and the success with early treatment of COVID, and yes, ivermectin, but also a recipe of other drugs. I understand he is widely read. I mean, that antidepressant is in some of these recipes that I think Joe Rogan took like 30 things. One of them was that drug that there's some positive studies on, and vitamin D and all kinds of stuff. So I don't know if you're familiar with this particular doctor.
No, I'm not particularly, no. But I would caution against taking cocktails of things where you don't know what's in them, you don't know what's working, you don't know how those things interact with each other. It's just a little bit dangerous.
Now that COVID-19 has brought mRNA technology into widespread use, what kind of positive innovations can you imagine in the near future?
So many that I couldn't even list them. It could be a whole show. I think we had all been advocating for mRNA vaccine technology for a long time. I wrote a report on this as a way to really change the way we do emerging infectious disease response before the pandemic. So we were all wanting this to happen. I used to have meetings and I would invite Moderna, and then we have all this like seating priority where you put companies, and I'd have to put Moderna like in this little small seat because nobody from like Sanofi or Merck or any of those people wanted to sit near them because they thought it was a small company. So it's really, really exciting. So I think we're going to get new vaccines, maybe for influenza, maybe for malaria. They're working on HIV vaccines, but it's also not just infectious disease. Moderna was started as a cancer company, because they were trying to make tumor vaccines, to make a vaccine against your specific tumor. So I think this is going to be a revolution in medicine, that mRNA vaccine technology really had the chance to shine, and it really showed. And now these companies like Moderna, BioNTech they're flooded with cash now, so they've got the ability to actually do these experiments and make all these drugs. So I think we will see kind of a renaissance in vaccine technologies because of what mRNA did, and it's really bright, the future.
Yeah, I'm super excited about these things. I think it really does look amazing. All right, let's try to get these 4 questions quickly. Jeff says, if an unvaccinated child under 12 contracts COVID, how long would you recommend waiting to get the child vaccinated after recovery?
I think you could probably wait. You can get the vaccine anytime you want after they're not contagious. So I'd wait at least 10 days, but you're probably not going to get a benefit for probably 90 days plus. So I think you can wait 3 months if you want to. Just don't bring the kid to the place to get vaccinated sick. People do show up when they just test positive, and then they feel bad that they tested positive. Like, I want the vaccine today, but you're contagious. Get out of here, basically. Yeah. I think anytime, but 90 days or so. This child is going to be pretty good for 90 days, unless Omicron changes that factor. But
all right, Scott is asking, some of your comments seem to imply that Fauci wouldn't have asked for lockdowns if we'd done more contact tracing earlier. Is that how you see it?
I do. I think that if you look at his comments early on, he said, we're not going to have this Wuhan type of thing, because most of us thought we would do better, that we would be able to keep up with cases, that we wouldn't foul up testing so badly. I don't think he would have. And if you listen to his early interviews, they're very different than what happens eventually. And again, I talked about this in my Ocon talk. And when you put if you tell a scientist, so I could tell you, how do you get rid of COVID-19? I would just say, no one leave their house ever. That's just an answer. But that's not necessarily what you want to do. And I think when you have this abdication by the federal government, the CDC sideline, and you're trying to figure out what to do, that's kind of how it all went about. And it wasn't just Fauci, it was also Deborah Birx, and it was even President Trump, because he was saying, why did de Blasio keep New York open? He should have shut it down. There was a lot of people saying that. But the reason that you do lockdowns, and the WHO says this all the time, is if there's policy, it's a sign of policy failure. If you're going to the lockdown, that means you've failed. And that's basically what happened in January, February, March. You did nothing. And then you have New York almost collapse their hospital system, and other governors panic. And that became the only solution, because it was too late then, because we had no way to know who was infected, who wasn't infected, because we couldn't test anyone. And that's all they did. And then they couldn't get it together. So I don't think anybody ever advocated that. And even now, you read the WHO's, their quote, she's like, not lockdowns. We'll say, we need to do a lot better, but not lockdowns. That's not something that public health people that actually know what they're talking about actually want. It's a sign of failure.
So looking back, do you think that if the CDC and the Trump administration, everybody had got their act together in January, got the tests organized, and do you think contact, test, trace, isolate could have worked in the United States? Not eradicated, we're not COVID zero, but significantly reducing deaths and cases.
Definitely. I mean, I think that we could have met cases as they came. We could have had the ability to test. We already knew that nursing homes were going to be highly susceptible because old people were really, really likely to have high risk. We could have fortified nursing homes. We could have made sure that hospitals had personal protective equipment, told them, make sure we could get ventilators in place. We could have come up with a plan to move patients around the country, around a state if hospitals got in trouble. We could have told the public, this is what we need. This is coming. You need to think about this. We could have given people recommendations. All of that could have been done, and we didn't do anything in January, February, March. Even just putting the N95s stopping the N95 shortage would have helped. None of that was done. It was just, as President Trump said, I always wanted to play it down. That's a direct quote. I mean, that's basically what happened. Our hands were tied, and they screwed up the testing so badly. I think that is the original sin of this pandemic, and it's still a problem. We still can't test like they can test in Europe or in Asia.
All right. My uni requires daily rapid testing and offers them free for those with exemptions from vaccination. I'm vaxxed, but I'm concerned about outbreaks. Is it worth convincing them to offer a rapid test to all, including the vaccinated?
It depends on your risk tolerance. I think if you're fully vaccinated, you know that if you get a breakthrough, it's going to be mild. You're not going to even have to call your doctor. So I think it's up to your own risk tolerance. In general, I'm not a big fan of testing asymptomatic people who are fully vaccinated because I think that breakthroughs are inevitable and that they're mild is a good thing. And it's not going to be something that we can continue to chase these mild cases because you're going to have COVID cases on your university campus 5 years from now. I think that we really want to stop spread amongst the unvaccinated and major outbreaks from occurring. And usually that's not going to involve the vaccinated. So I'm not a big proponent of testing of just asymptomatic screening of vaccinated people because I think I don't see where this ends. There's no off-ramp if we're doing that.
Right. I think, okay. How does COVID measure up in mortality rates and the way it was contained in contrast to the Spanish flu? Were the methods of lockdowns for Spanish flu more effective than what politicians are doing today?
The 1918 flu killed more people. It killed 50 to 100 million people around the world. We're in the single digit millions, which is still too many. But yep. The sheer number of Americans killed was more. But obviously, it's a totally different thing that's happening. They used masks. There was anti-mask people out there back then. Some schools closed. Some schools moved outdoors. I don't know that it was more effective. It's very hard to know because it's not all well studied, or at least. It's not, you can't compare them pound for pound. The excess mortality in New York City was higher for COVID-19 than it was for 1918. At least that data is out there. But also people couldn't travel that far and that fast. People weren't as mobile in 1918. There were no airplanes. People kind of stayed around in their own towns, or they went on a train or whatever they did at that time. It wasn't the same connectedness, which I think makes it hard to know how effective restriction of movement was at that time. And you actually had the end of World War I, which was the opposite of restriction of movement, which actually facilitated it. So it's a little bit hard to compare all of that completely together. But I think that COVID is not like, it's much better than the 1918 flu. It's just a different type of thing. Hard to make strong comparisons.
All right. Do you still two more questions?
Yeah.
Keep rolling in. Aspiration is necessary for vaccination? That's a question mark.
Okay, so there's some people that think that you should, so aspiration means you draw back on the syringe a little bit before you inject, just to make sure you're not in a vein. There's some people who think that there's a hypothesis that people got myocarditis because maybe they're in a vein and some of the material gets leaked into that. I don't know if that's true or not. In general, you're taught to aspirate a little bit when you inject just to make sure you're not in a vein. It's not always necessary. It's just a practice that lots of people do.
Okay. All right. A Fauci question. Fauci said he doesn't care about individual rights and then he is science itself a few weeks ago. Were they taken out of context, those comments?
I think the question about individual rights, I think he basically said, I'm not here to talk about rights. I'm here to talk about how to stop COVID. That's basically what he said. And this is exactly what I'm saying. He's focused on one thing. That's the task he was given. He's not thinking about, it's not his job to think about individual rights and what the law should be or what the not. They've given him a tool to say, they've given him this task to figure out what tools can we use to stop COVID-19. Whatever, that's it. He's not asking about individual. He's not being asked within the confines of this. That's probably what he meant by that. Obviously, he cares about individual rights because I think most people do, at least some learning of some
sense of that. Yeah.
Yeah, and then the I am science. I think what's happening is he's getting attacked a lot, and I think I probably wouldn't have said it that way because it kind of, I think it got I don't know if it got taken out of context, but it's being used in a way that probably he didn't mean. He meant to say that what he's trying to do is, save the world using scientific principles, and he's getting attacked. And it's not just about him, because I think that some of those people would still attack him, even if or attack whoever. If it wasn't Fauci, they would attack whoever was saying that vaccines are good, because or whatever it might be. I think it's gotten a very political. I think some of the exchanges he gets into with Senator Paul and Senator Cruz probably aren't productive for anybody. But I do understand what he means when he's saying that they're attacking science, because I do think they're attacking science. If they're passing laws to force hospitals to give ivermectin, they're passing laws to say a private company can't have vaccine requirements. They're passing laws that if you get fired because your employer says you need to be vaccinated, that you'll get unemployment now. I mean, that I think that there is a real problem we have with anti-science rhetoric that I've never seen before in the last 20 years or so.
I mean, I think we agree that one of the big challenges is, like in every field in the world in which we live today, that because government has its hands in everything, including medicine, that everything becomes politicized, and it's inevitable that once you get government money, once the government is controlling all these aspects of healthcare, that things get politicized, and it becomes people are not going to pay attention to science; they're going to pay attention to politics, starting with politicians on down. Yeah. All right. Thanks, Amesh. This was great. Really appreciate it. We went well over the hour, so I really appreciate that. But I think we covered a lot, and everybody seems really thankful for that. So thank you. Feel free to jump off whenever, and I'm sure we'll have you on again as things develop.
All right.
Sadly, this is not a going away, this story.
Thanks for having me, and hope that was useful to your audience.
Absolutely. Thanks, Amesh. Thanks, guys. I really appreciate it. A lot of questions, a lot of good questions, respectful questions. I appreciate that. Wow, I mean, some of the comments on the comment section are not very respectful or very nice, but so be it. Wow. All right. We are going to, let's see, we've got a show tomorrow at 2 p.m. We are, I think, like $44 short of our goal of $600. So if somebody wants to jump in and just top it off, that'd be great. As I said, we're going to have a series of guests coming on the show this month and going into the months into 2022. I hope you appreciate that and you value that. If so, please become a monthly contributor to the Yaron Brook Show at yaronbrookshow.com/support. Patreon subscribe star. Don't forget to like the show if you like it. It's interesting. YouTube now has suppressed the dislike. So while you guys can press this dislike button, I can't see how many of you have actually disliked the show. I can see how many of you like the show, but not how many dislike the show. And I'm sure there's a bunch of you who have pressed the dislike based on the comments in the comment section. But I find that interesting that YouTube is trying to spare my feelings by not allowing me to actually see the number of dislikes. All right, tomorrow at 2, then we'll probably do a show on Monday, and then I'm gone for the rest of the week for the debate. Those of you in Texas and Austin, hopefully you can make the debate with Yoram Hazony on Wednesday. Individualism versus conservatism. Thanks, everybody. It was great to have you on. Thanks for the support. Thanks for the questions. I appreciate it. Talk to you. Thank you, John. Really appreciate that. I'll talk to you all tomorrow.